Holding a short episode in American aviation history, Trump Shuttle, as owned by business magnate and future President Donald Trump, was the culmination of a takeover bid for the Eastern Airlines Shuttle, once one of the most profitable and busiest air corridors in the United States that operated between Washington, D.C., New York, and Boston. Sadly, despite Trump's many ambitious proposals for the shuttle brand, specifically his desire to transform the firm into a luxury carrier, the lingering instability carried over from the Eastern Airlines days, combined with the collapse of the aviation market as a result of the Gulf War, meant Trump Shuttle would face financial ruin within years as debts rose, and thus he had no choice but to offload the carrier to US Air in order to avoid his own personal bankruptcy. The origins of what will become Trump Shuttle lie in the peculiar economics of the northeastern United States air corridor, a market that from the early 1960s had functioned almost as an aerial railway, with frequent walk-up flights between New York, Boston, and Washington being essential for the region's political, financial, and academic life, and the shuttle concept evolved to meet that demand. The most important of these services was the Eastern Airlines Shuttle, established in 1961 and operating primarily between New York's LaGuardia Airport, Boston's Logan Airport, and Washington National, and for decades it was an East Coast institution, carrying millions of passengers a year and commanding a powerful brand loyalty among business travelers. And even as the wider airline industry lurched from crisis to crisis after deregulation in 1978, the shuttle remained a rare bright spot. By the mid-1980s, it was generating tens of millions of dollars in annual operating profit and accounting for a disproportionate share of Eastern's cash flow, despite the airline as a whole sliding steadily towards insolvency. Though by the end of the decade, its operations were marked by intensifying competition and labor unrest, with Pan American World Airways, long Eastern's great rival, launching its own shuttle in 1986, breaking what had effectively been a monopoly and beginning an expensive marketing war along the corridor. At the same time, Eastern Airlines, under the ownership of Texas Air Corporation and the chairmanship of Frank Lorenzo, became embroiled in bitter disputes with its unions, with strikes by mechanics, supported by pilots and flight attendants, disrupting operations in early 1989 and badly damaging customer confidence, with picket lines appearing outside shuttle terminals and passengers defected in large numbers to Pan Am. Faced with a deteriorating financial position, Eastern moved to monetize its most valuable asset, and the shuttle operation was separated into a distinct corporate entity, complete with aircraft, slots, terminals, and staff, with the explicit intention of selling it to raise cash, with Lorenzo believing that the ideal buyer should not be a competing airline, but a high-profile outsider willing to pay a premium for instant market presence. In this context, Donald Trump, then a flamboyant New York property developer at the height of his public profile, appeared, having been intrigued by aviation for some time, with March 1988 seeing him make his first concrete move into the sector by acquiring 3 Sikorsky S-61 helicopters formerly operated by Resorts International Airlines, with the service linking the Manhattan heliports with Atlantic City in under an hour, charging premium fares and offering a foretaste of the luxury positioning that would later define his airline ambitions. It was during this period that Trump and Lorenzo were introduced, initially in a social setting rather than a boardroom, with Trump fitting Lorenzo's preferred profile of buyer precisely, and had already shown, through Trump Air, that aviation appealed to him not merely as a business, but as a symbol, and negotiations gathered pace through the middle of 1988, with Trump increasingly convinced that ownership of the shuttle would complement his hotels, casinos, and personal brand. By October 1988, an agreement had been reached in principle, and Trump agreed to pay $365 million for the shuttle operation, a price widely regarded as steep when compared to the costs of launching a new airline from scratch, though this figure included a fleet of Boeing 727 aircraft, prime landing slots at slot-restricted airports such as LaGuardia, established shuttle terminals in Boston and Washington, and, critically, the right to place the Trump name prominently on the company and its aircraft. The existing shuttle had long been a no-frills operation, tailored to time-sensitive business travelers, but even at this early stage, Trump made clear that he intended to overturn that philosophy and reposition the service as a luxury airline, and almost immediately after the October agreement, Eastern Airlines filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, a move that underscored how precarious the situation had become. For a time, the outcome remained uncertain, with other bidders expressing interest, most notably America West Airlines, which submitted a competing proposal, but its financing was not in place and the offer failed to materialize, though by early 1989, the deterioration of Eastern's position threatened to derail the transaction, and Trump argued that the strikes and uncertainty had eroded the value of the asset and sought to renegotiate both the price and the terms, including the addition of more aircraft to compensate for lost market share. At the same time, unions protested that selling the shuttle would strip Eastern of its only remaining profitable operation and hasten the airline's demise, and throughout the spring of 1989, the fate of the shuttle was debated in courtrooms and boardrooms alike, while bankruptcy judges ultimately rejected labor objections, ruling that concerns over Eastern's survival were speculative, and in May 1989 approved Trump's offer. The deal was finalized in June, financed through a loan from a syndicate of banks led by Citibank, and Trump formally took control of the shuttle just after midnight on June 8, 1989, marking the beginning of operations under the Trump Shuttle name, with the launch being carefully choreographed and widely covered by the press, with aircraft repainted into a striking white livery with bold Trump branding, and terminal spaces previously associated with Eastern were rapidly redecorated with temporary signage, plants, and cosmetic upgrades. Trump presented the takeover as a restoration of an East Coast institution battered by strikes and mismanagement, promising that safety would be paramount and that the service and aesthetics would set a new standard for short-haul travel. And although fares were not cut, limited promotional offers were hinted at, and the emphasis was placed squarely on quality, reliability, and image. Operationally, the shuttle resumed its traditional pattern of hourly flights between New York, Boston, and Washington, with up to 64 departures a day, and Trump invested heavily in refurbishing aircraft interiors, fitting them with leather seating, maple wood veneer, chrome seatbelt fittings, and gold-colored lavatory fixtures, features commonly associated with private jets' more than 40-minute shuttle hops. Complimentary meals were offered, including chicken and steak on some flights, alongside free champagne, beer, and wine, while the airline also positioned itself as technologically progressive, introducing some of the earliest passenger self-service check-in kiosks at LaGuardia in partnership with Kinetics, trialing laptop computer rentals through Lapstop, and installing the GTE Airphone system to allow in-flight telephone calls. The summer of 1989 saw an intense battle for market share between Trump Shuttle and Pan Am Shuttle, with both sides spending millions of dollars on advertising campaigns, with Trump himself being deeply involved in the marketing effort, writing some advertising copy, and insisting that his reputation as a demanding businessman would translate into punctuality and superior service. This strategy appeared to work, and by the end of August, Trump Shuttle had recovered dramatically from the post-strike slump, capturing between 40 and 50% of the northeastern shuttle market, a remarkable rebound from the roughly 26% share it had inherited at the time of the takeover, and more than 1,000 jobs were preserved in the process, many filled by former Eastern employees who returned under Trump's ownership with their pay and seniority intact. The optimism of the summer was punctured in August 1989 by a high-profile incident that underscored the risks inherent to an aging fleet, when a Trump Shuttle Boeing 727 arriving in Boston suffered a failure in the nose landing gear on touchdown, forcing an emergency response. And although no passengers were injured, the subsequent investigations indicated that the fault stemmed from maintenance errors dating back to Eastern's ownership, before the aircraft had been transferred to Trump. Conscious of the potential damage to public confidence, Trump personally boarded the next shuttle flight to Boston, turning the episode into a demonstration of confidence and control rather than retreat. And while the immediate crisis was contained, the incident marked a subtle shift in public perception, reminding passengers that glamour could not entirely insulate an airline from operational realities. Throughout early 1990, the airline continued to operate its intensive schedule of hourly services using an all-Boeing 727 fleet, and from an operational standpoint, the airline was covering its direct running costs, but interest payments on its loans were relentless, and profitability remained elusive, with financial results later showing that during 1990, Trump Shuttle generated operating revenues of roughly $172 million, but recorded an operating loss of more than $40 million, with a net loss approaching $69 million. Competitive pressure from Pan Am Shuttle remained intense, and both carriers spent heavily on advertising to defend their positions on the corridor, with Trump himself remaining closely involved in the airline's public image, insisting that the shuttle was an aesthetic triumph, even as the balance sheets deteriorated, though by the spring of 1990, cost-cutting became unavoidable. Frills such as concierge desks were quietly removed, staffing levels were reduced, and less popular weekend flights were cancelled because they failed to cover their costs, while in March, the airline introduced a customer compensation scheme that offered vouchers to passengers delayed by more than 15 minutes, regardless of whether the delays were caused by weather or air traffic control, an effort to reinforce the brand's promise of reliability at a time when punctuality was increasingly difficult to guarantee. The most visible sign of upheaval came at the end of June 1990, when Trump abruptly dismissed the airline's president, Bruce Nobles, who had previously overseen the shuttle under Eastern ownership, with Nobles being replaced by Richard Cozy, who assumed the role of president and chief operating officer, with Trump publicly blaming management for the airline's mounting losses, stating that while the shuttle was an aesthetic success, it had yet to become the financial success he expected. The leadership change coincided with Trump's broader negotiation with banks over his sprawling business empire, as difficulties at his Atlantic City casinos forced him in June 1990 to cede control of several holdings to creditors in order to avoid personal bankruptcy, and in an attempt to generate additional cash flow, Trump Shuttle increasingly turned to charter operations during 1990, using spare aircraft that would otherwise have sat idle. One of the most prominent of these missions took place in June, when the airline carried Nelson Mandela on an 8-city tour of the United States following his release from prison, a high-profile assignment that briefly cast the struggling carrier in a favorable light, while charter flying also formed part of a broader plan developed by new management by late summer, which envisaged using aircraft for leisure services to the Caribbean and Mexico, offering weekend flights to Atlantic City, and gradually withdrawing the less reliable Boeing 727-100s in favor of the larger 727-200 series. Any hope that these measures might stabilize the airline was badly undermined in August 1990, when Iraq's invasion of Kuwait sent shockwaves through the global energy markets, with jet fuel prices doubling almost overnight, hitting an airline already operating on thin margins, and demand weakened further as economic uncertainty spread, with the combination of rising costs and falling revenue proving fatal. In September 1990, Trump Shuttle ran out of cash and defaulted on its debt, an event that effectively placed the airline under the control of its lenders, led by Citibank, even though flights continued to operate, while Eastern Airlines, from which the shuttle operation had originally been carved, ceased operations altogether in January 1991, underlining the wider turmoil in the U.S. airline industry and stripping away any lingering sense that Trump Shuttle was an isolated failure. Financial results for the year reflected these conditions, and the operating revenue for 1991 fell slightly to around $169 million, while the airline still recorded an operating loss of roughly $25 million and a net loss exceeding $58 million. And although the operating margin improved slightly compared with 1990, the business remained firmly in the red and had still never achieved profitability. These losses were particularly damaging because Trump had personally guaranteed $135 million of the airline's debt, leaving his own finances exposed at a time when his casino empire and other ventures were also under severe strain. And in an effort to generate income beyond its core shuttle routes, Trump Shuttle continued to undertake charter work during 1991, building on arrangements put in place the previous year. During the Gulf War period, the airline secured a U.S. government contract to transport military personnel between major domestic bases including Dover, Charleston, Travis, McCord, and Kelly Air Force bases, with these flights providing some utilization for otherwise surplus aircraft and crews, but they were insufficient to alter the airline's overall financial trajectory, with the core shuttle operation having become a shrinking market contested by weakened competitors. Behind the scenes, attention increasingly turned to finding a permanent solution to the airline's ownership, and in April 1991, the Trump Organization announced that it was close to an agreement under which Northwest Airlines would assume control of the shuttle, with the proposed deal relieving Trump of his personal guarantee in exchange for handing over operations, and for a time it appeared that all parties, including the banks, were aligned. However, the negotiations exposed the structural difficulties embedded within the business, with Trump Shuttle's unions demanding pay and conditions equivalent to those enjoyed by Northwest employees, while Trump was unwilling to reduce the valuation of the airline to reflect its deteriorated state, and in August 1991, Northwest formally abandoned the acquisition, leaving the shuttle once again without a buyer. The competitive landscape shifted further in July 1991 when Delta Airlines agreed to purchase the rival Pan Am shuttle, with this development leaving Trump Shuttle as the weaker of the two remaining shuttle brands and reduced its appeal as a standalone operation. And with Northwest gone and Delta consolidating the competition, the banks moved decisively to seek another operator, with their objective being no longer to preserve Trump's airline, but to recover as much value as possible from the assets and route authorities. That search culminated in December 1991 when US Air reached an agreement with Citibank and the Trump Organization to take operational control of Trump Shuttle for up to 10 years, with an option to purchase it outright after 5. And under the terms of the deal, Trump would be relieved of at least $100 million of his personal guarantee, and possibly as much as $110 million, leaving him responsible for a far smaller residual sum estimated at between $25 and $35 million. Although the Trump Shuttle name would persist briefly, real control of the airline effectively passed out of Trump's hands at that point, and on April 7, 1992, Trump Shuttle Incorporated ceased to exist when it was merged into a newly created holding company, Shuttle Incorporated, a restructuring designed to facilitate the transfer of operational control and draw a clear legal line under Trump's ownership. 5 days later, on April 12, Shuttle Incorporated began flying under the name US Air Shuttle, while at the point of transition, the shuttle operation was still flying its traditional high-frequency schedule, while the remaining $245 million in debt associated with the shuttle was left with the banks of the restructured company, severing Trump's direct financial exposure and bringing his airline ambitions to a definitive close. Under US Air's stewardship, the shuttle was repositioned less as a personal brand statement and more as a strategic component of a broader northeastern network, and the airline publicly stated its intention to keep the existing workforce largely intact while installing its own management team and gradually integrating the shuttle into its wider operational and marketing strategy. And although the Boeing 727 fleet was retained initially, US Air made clear that these aging trijets would need to be replaced within a few years. Shuttle Incorporated remained a subsidiary of US Air for several years, providing a corporate wrapper around the operation, while longer-term decisions were made, and in November 1997, US Air exercised its option to purchase the remaining outstanding shares of Shuttle Incorporated, fully absorbing the business and ending any residual distinction between the shuttle and the airline's mainline operations. And on July 1, 2000, Shuttle Incorporated itself was merged into US Airways and today operates as American Airlines Shuttle, following the merger of US Airways and American Airlines in October 2015. In conclusion, Donald Trump's vision for the shuttle, while highly ambitious for the time, became an unfortunate victim of circumstance more than overwhelming mismanagement, as the failure of the venture was not the result of a single bad decision or inherently flawed idea, but of a convergence of structural weaknesses, adverse timing, and strategic overreach that left little margin for error. While the underlying shuttle concept was demonstrably viable, and Trump demonstrated his ability to turn the carrier around with a 40 to 50% market share recovery, the initial purchase price, the oil shock triggered by the Gulf War, and the strategic decision to reposition the shuttle as a luxury product narrowed its room for maneuver in a market that rewarded reliability far more than spectacle.